Great. Okay, so welcome everyone to this last 2020 Mumble talk. We're very happy to have Elizabeth Camp here, inaugurating this other branch of the Mumble of the Mumble research, but also concluding this concluding this 2020 cycle of talks. And I'm particularly pleased to have Professor Kam here. As you maybe know, she's associate professor at Rutgers University, and she works particularly on thoughts and utterances that don't fit standard propositional models. And she has worked on sarcasm, metaphors, slurs, other forms of loaded language, and she's interested in the cognitive perspectives and emotions, as well as in non-sentential representational systems like maps and diagrams. And she has published extensively on these and other topics. Some examples, which are probably my favorite examples, but there are others, of course, as paper in philosophical studies, metaphor and that certain je ne sais quoi, or thinking with maps. And also, she has also worked on fiction and imagination. And there is a beautiful paper in Philosophical Perspectives 2016, which is named Perspectives in Imaginative Engagement with Fiction. As far as I know, she's now working on the topic of perspectives. And maybe we will learn something about this today. The title of her talk is Economics of Imagination, Showing and Telling with Pictures and Words. So just a few indication before she starts. So the first thing is that for those of you who hasn't done this already, you can download the handout of the talk. You can see in the chat the link to the Google Drive doc. So please download it, because we are going to keep our cameras on. If it's possible, if it doesn't interfere with the quality of the connection. The talk will be divided into 3 parts. After each section, we will have about 10 minutes of discussion concerning the section that has been done. And then after the end of the talk, we will have a longer and more thorough discussion about the overall project. So practically, I would say that if during each section of the talk you have a question, you realize that you have a question, please write it down in the chat. So don't write a question, but just write that you want to ask a question, so I can take note that you want to say something. And right after the end of the first and second slot, I can give you the word. I hope I said everything. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marta. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm just so happy to get out of my pleasant prison here. So yes, I'm pleased that you're saying that I'm inaugurating this other strand, because this paper is in a way itself a kind of bridge from work that I've done and I've continued to think about representational formats and about cognitive perspectives. So work in sort of language or representation broadly construed and in mind, and it's sort of taking it and applying it to imagination with aesthetics, especially in mind. So it is itself a kind of bridge paper. I am going to do something that's unfair and that is unwise, and I tell my graduate students not to do, which is basically there are 2 papers I want to give, and so there's too much material, but it's so interesting to me. What I'm really interested in is at the intersection of those topics, and so to get to that point, I need to present this other stuff. So there'll be some so I'll be as reasonable as I can, but there'll be a lot. So as I said, there's in a way, so the paper has 3 sections. I'm not totally confident I'll get to the 3rd section, though I would really like to. It's smaller anyway. The first section, so the overall topic here is just thinking about how do pictures and words work differently, and how is that especially but how does that become relevant and interesting in an aesthetic context? How do artists use the differences between pictures and words in different ways? And so the first section of the talk will be basically sort of about representational formats and then thinking about some implications of that for aesthetics. And the second one is about perspectives and the ways in which pictures and words manipulate and encourage perspectival interpretation in different kinds of ways because of the different formats that they use. And then the third section is about the kind of force, the kind of what compels about the two media in virtue of these differences that we've rehearsed earlier. So that's what I want to do. I guess, as Marta said, I turned out I hate screen sharing. So I'm very happy with the number of faces I can see here. That makes me feel like I'm talking to somebody. That's good. But there is this handout, and the handout is important. So make sure you have access to it. So now I will begin to talk with the handout. So I want to take as my sort of focus here, the thing I want to sort of ruminate on for the time is this old canard of picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I looked it up. Apparently, like, it's been called an ancient Chinese saying, but it's not. It's attributed to, it's one of these things people have always already been saying this thing, but nobody knows exactly what it means. So I want to think about, what does that mean? What are people thinking when they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and which words and for what purposes? What's the worth here, and what are the kinds of currency and trade-off that we're engaged in? And so to try to focus the conversation and the thinking, I want to take a kind of minimal pair contrasting two presentations of the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. This is the first page of the handout. And so I'm just going to take a little time, just look at this thing, right? Look at these two paragraphs from Genesis, read through them, and then look at this painting from Caravaggio from 1602. Okay, so just get this in your head. Take a little bit of time. I'm not going to read out loud. I'm going to read through it, but you do the same, and then we'll come back together. Okay. All right. I am going to, I read quickly to myself, and I've read it before, but I can't bear the silence any longer, so I'm going to keep forward. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, so we've got a story and we've got a picture, right? Both very famous, both sort of a deeply complex and resonant scene. How do they handle those differently? So the first thing I want to talk about is notational differences. Differences in representational format. And one, sort of mantra for me here is notational differences matter. They may be, in philosophy, we often say like a merely notational difference, but the part of the thing is notational differences can really matter. So just, warm up, semiotic systems different semiotic systems, different sign systems, different systems of representation and meaning have different principles of formation and interpretation. So they exploit different principles. And broadly, I mean, this should be kind of familiar, but different people use these terms in different ways. So the way I'm thinking about it, syntactic principles are principles that identify basic constituents of the vehicle, and then rules for combining them into larger units. Semantic principles map, they assign values to those constituents and to the whole in virtue of the rules of the constituents, the meaning assigned to the constituents. And then pragmatics takes the output of that. I'm not committing to anything like a linear order of interpretation or anything like that, but it takes the output of the syntactic and semantic principles, and it, which gives you encoded meaning, and sort of interprets that, modifies and amplifies that meaning in the light of broader communicative assumptions, broadly Gricean communicative assumptions. And meaning, at least communication, communicative meaning, always involves a complex package of these three syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. But they can get traded off in different kinds of ways, right? Different parts of the system contribute in different ways in different cases. So that's part of what we see working out here is even if you've got the same end product, there's going to be trade-offs in how that end product is achieved. So the way I'm thinking about representational systems, lots of people like to talk about a kind of cleavage between iconic and discursive formats, and basically they're thinking here of images and sentences. It's one of the things that I'm interested in, I've been especially interested in maps, and so one of the things that I'm interested in is I don't think this is a cleavage. I think this is a continuum. There's a continuum of kinds of representational principles and systems. And I also think it's multidimensional. It's not just a single linear difference. And so some of the things I think it's worth pointing out here are the following. So at the extreme and the sort of at the limit, fully iconic or roughly imagistic systems. There are two thoughts I want to try to spell out here. They're analog and they're concrete. People have famously meant very different things by analog. Two of them that I think are relevant here are so iconic or imagistic systems, they represent very highly specific values, whether that has to be truly continual, there can't be any digitality. Not going to get really worked up about that, but highly specific values along dense magnitudes. So there's a magnitude like distance. It might be a metric, and then there are many different values along that magnitude, and an analog system represents a specific value along that magnitude. So that's one meaning for analog. That's close to the sort of continuous meaning. And they also represent many different dimensions of content simultaneously and in direct relations. So here, it's not just that the picture depicts a particular color or a particular hue within the color spectrum. It also, at that very same time, represents saturation and reflectance and location and shape and all of these different features, all in direct relation to one another. One way of seeing this with maps is that it's not just that you get the location of a particular object at a particular, one location of a particular object. The map simultaneously presents that object in relation to all the other depicted objects, and all of them in their relations to one another. Okay, so that's these two dimensions of analogicity. And then in terms of the way in which full iconic systems are concrete, the way in which they represent the values they represent is by exploiting physical resemblances between the vehicle content. So they exploit physical features of the vehicle itself, and they use those as part of the representational principle. And so in pictures, spatial location and relation is used to represent spatial location and relation. The color of, on the painting, on the canvas, is used to represent color of that's being represented. Other representational systems that are still at least partly iconic exploit physical features of the vehicle, but they don't necessarily use them to represent physical features of the content. So, for instance, maps use spatial structure to represent spatial structure, but they also might use, say, color to represent, political affiliation, right? So you might have a map of, or intensity of COVID and new COVID cases or something like that, right? So a map like that is partly iconic in that it's using these aspects of that's using a physical feature of the vehicle, but it's just established and it's exploiting an isomorphism between that value of the vehicle and what is being represented, but it's not an isomorphism between like color and the very same feature, color, right? It's isomorphism between this magnitude and some other magnitude. Okay, so that's sort of a rough, that's a way of spelling out part of what it means to be iconic, some important things about what it means to be iconic. At the other extreme, people talk about discursive systems, and I'm thinking about this as propositional representational systems. So they are sparse and abstract. So what do we, again, we can mean lots of different things by this. So here are 4 things that I want to mean by it. 1, the syntactic principle for individuating vehicular parts, saying what is a part of the vehicle, is highly digital. So there are lots of different ways that you can token the sound, the word bed, right? Orally, it can sound many different ways, and all that matters is it sort of counts as the word bed. Whereas all these variations in the color of the picture matter to, what it is representing, to what kind of representational vehicle it is, what type of representational vehicle it is. So all these differences in words don't matter. So the syntactic principle for individuating vehicular parts is highly digital. It collects many different instantiations into a limited number of types. And the same thing goes for the semantic principle that assigns values. So many different kinds of things. There's lots and lots of different variations among beds that still count as bed, right? So the relation that is word meaning collects lots of different, abstracts away from many different variations in the vehicle and from many variations in what is represented, and says, these are all of the same type and these are all of the same type, right? And all of those, many of those kinds of analogous variations in a picture really do matter, both for whether it's to the vehicle and to the what is represented. Okay, so that's digitality. The second thing is that the syntactic principle for combining parts is sparse. So, whether you think that the principle that constitutes the combinatorial principle for propositional structure, whether you think that's predication or functional application or merge or whatever. There's a lot of debate within philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, linguistics, about what the combinatorial principle is exactly. But basically everybody's agreeing it's some kind of asymmetric pairwise combinatorial principle. It takes 2 things, puts them together to make one thing, right? And there's some kind of asymmetry. There's something like a subject and predicate, or something like, concept and object, whatever. Something like a property, object and property. So that's it's just a couple little parts, 2 parts being merged together into one, maybe 3 if you depending on what you believe about predicate modification. So that that contrasts with the way in which maps and pictures look like they're taking a whole lot of parts and combining them simultaneously by putting them in direct relation with one another. Okay, so that's the sparseness. And then the propositional systems are also highly abstract. Again, I want to say there are 2 aspects of that. One is, the more obvious one, is that the semantic principle mapping vehicular parts to values is arbitrary, right? So there's nothing about in contrast to exploiting physical resemblances of the vehicle, involving the vehicle, there's nothing about the sound bed that makes it particularly suited to represent beds, right? That's just, it's an arbitrary relation. So that's, fairly familiar. The other thing is there's also something really abstract and distinctively abstract about the syntactic principle that combines the basic parts, the words, into wholes. And the way I put this is that it's highly neutral. So one way of thinking about this, I think, is if you think about branching tree structure. That we're very familiar with in linguistics as the thing that, a representation of the way in which the parts, the values of the words get combined to make up whole propositions, to construct whole propositions, which are what is whole sentences. But you can take that same branching tree structure and take what it means to have a common node and 2 branches. That can also be interpreted very differently. It can be interpreted as a phylogenetic tree, right? In that case, in a phylogenetic tree, that means that the significance of a node and 2 branches is that the nodes at the end of the branch share a common ancestor, right? So you have the same abstract sparse structure. It's not asymmetric in this case, but we can make an analogous case that is asymmetric. But what it means to, to be combined with a branching structure is a much more robust, substantial relationship than it is when you combine two parts than the relationship that's denoted by, functional application or predication. And that means that if you have a phylogenetic tree, you can only represent the kinds of things that can be in familial relations, ancestry relations, right? So you can only put in a phylogenetic tree things that stand in descendants relations. Whereas the kinds of things you can put in the branching tree structure of a sentential system are much more various because the syntactic principle is much more neutral. Okay, so what it means to combine these different elements with the combinatorial principle employed with a propositional system, it just means to combine them, right? Or to apply the predicate to the subject, right? That's a very thin, neutral principle in comparison to the much more robust, laden, thick principle of sharing a common ancestor, right? And that difference that's both a branching tree structure. That difference in the significance of that combinatorial principle makes real differences in what can be expressed in the two systems. Okay? All right, so that's a little bit of a, I don't know, that was a big thing to lay on you, but that's this idea of a combinatorial principle being really neutral. Okay, so that's my, I could give you a whole talk about differences in representational format. I just tried to compress it into, 10 minutes. As a way of trying to spell out this idea that representational systems form a continuum from iconic to discursive formats. And there's a lot of interesting variation between those two extremes and a lot of ways in which you can vary the different dimensions that I've just talked about. That's all really interesting in its own right. Why do these differences matter? Well, because differences in format along these dimensions produce different profiles of representational possibility. They affect what you can encode directly, what you have to encode if you're going to encode something else, and what you can't encode. And that's interesting. That has important implications for processing, of interpretation, and for the kinds of commitments you can undertake. So now let me sort of narrow in on pictures versus sentences a little bit more. I was talking more generally about iconic systems above. So the way pictures work is roughly, and again, there's a huge, one of the reasons I've worked on maps as opposed to pictures is because pictures are too hard and there's too much going on there. Maps seem simpler, but let me, tiptoe into the world of pictures. So pictures represent, when they represent abstract contents, which I think they can do, they do that by anchoring that abstract content in what people often call, following Hoagland, bare bones contents here. So the anchored content is the content that is directly connected to content in parts of the vehicle, things that the vehicle signifies. So anchored content is, and I'm going to give you 3 things here. Anchored content in pictures, it's instantiate. So this is something really distinctive about the way that pictures work as opposed to the way that, say, maps or graphs or diagrams work. So a picture, it represents what it represents at the limit by instantiating what it is representing. So a picture represents scarlet by being partly scarlet, right? It does the way in which, whereas, a sentence doesn't do that at all. And a map might represent political affiliation or COVID, positivity rate, not by instantiating that very feature, but by, exploiting a isomorphism to the feature of the physical feature of color. So it actually instantiates the property that's being represented. Second, anchored content is determinate, right? So you can represent more abstract contents, but only by instantiating some more determinate feature. And in particular, if you want to represent red, which is a determinable, you have to do that by representing a more determinate feature like being scarlet, a determinate feature. And then the Third thing is that anchored content is, the way I'm putting this is, non-selective across a value class. So if you want to represent being red, or you want to represent being scarlet, you have to also represent color across the board, right? Pretty, I mean, people can play with this, but so if you're going to go in for representing color, then you have to give color to all the different parts of the picture. You can't, or color is representationally significant across the picture. So, if you look, well, I'll just keep going and then we'll turn back to the picture. Okay, so that's, I think, three. So there's a lot of debate about how rich the meaning is that can be encoded in pictures. I'm not particularly interested right now in drawing that boundary between what's in the picture and what's extrapolated from the picture. What I do want to say is that non-implicated meaning that is I think that we do, intuitively, we talk about very rich contents being represented in the pictures. Like if we look at the Caravaggio, right, it depicts Abraham having his hand stayed by the angel at the moment of slaying Isaac, right? That's very, very rich content. And he's, looking a certain way and in a certain gesture and all that. That's very, very rich content. I'm happy to say that that's all in the picture. It's all part of the pictorial meaning, not just something we do on the basis of it. But all of that rich content has to be anchored in some way in the pictorial meaning. In the bare bones content, in what's actually marked, given by meaning that is marked on the canvas. So the way I'm putting it here is pictorial meaning that is non-implicated is, not sort of Gricean meaning, is amplified from bare contents that are derived from the marks, by amplification from this anchored content. So you have the anchored content, and then we use perceptual recognition, distinctively perceptual mechanisms, which can be extremely rich, to amplify that anchored content into much richer content. Like there is an object located at a particular place in a scene. That object is a person. That person is a man. It is an old man. It is Abraham, right? He is anguished. He is about to murder. He is about to sacrifice his son. So to the extent that those richer contents can be depicted in the picture, it is by amplification through perceptual recognition of marked aspects, bare bone contents, which are determined by the marked surface. And so to do that, to represent those more abstract contents, like that Abraham is confused and relieved that the angel appears and that the angel has pointed out the ram. If the picture depicts that, which I think it can, it has to do that by anchoring that in meaning which is instantiated, determinate, and non-selective. Okay, so that means if Caravaggio wants to go in for the business of depicting that, representing that, he has to make a bunch of choices about more concrete things that he's going to represent. By contrast, so now that all might, hopefully, that seemed all kind of pretty obvious. But now, if we contrast that with what happens with language, language can encode these kinds of abstract contents directly without anchoring, selectively without going in for the entire class, and indeterminately, right? So we could just be told that Abraham was wearing a red robe without being told anything else about what exact color of red, who else was wearing what, and and because, in particular, more generally, because language is so abstract, it can represent very abstract contents without this has a much wider expressive range representing these very abstract contents. So, in particular, language excels at representing causal relations between spatiotemporally disparate events, which is something that can't be done directly in a picture. It can represent purely quantificational information, right? You can say somebody said something without saying who or what was said. And so that kind of selectivity about purely abstract information can be very useful. You can just be very efficient if that's what you want to communicate. So we tend in philosophy to sort of valorize expressive range, and that is a great thing, expressive power. But that also comes at a commensurate cost, right? So language can only represent concrete contents indirectly by ostension, by pointing to, by evoking either a real sample or a recalled sample. And most relations, like spatial relations, other kinds of connections between, it can represent any connection at once, but it has to represent most connections separately as distinct as distinct specifications. Whereas if you're in map system or a pictorial system, people like to say you get all these relations, they come along as a free ride. Instead of having to deduce what the relations are among these disparate elements, they just are all there bundled for you, presented at once. So it's tedious to spell it all out in language. Okay, so that was this sort of very rapid fire tour through the differences in these representational formats. What difference does that make if we take those kinds of observations about representational format and apply them to a more aesthetic, think about them in an aesthetic context? Well, different media present different terrains of expressive possibility and challenge. And that's something that artists have to and get to deal with, right? So part of the excitement of making and consuming art is carving a path through that terrain of expressive possibility. So it, as a kind of simple story, you could say that pictures tend to awaken the senses because they, traffic so heavily in concrete imagistic, rich concrete imagistic meaning. The Council of Trent, encouraged art that would do this, and patrons paid Caravaggio to awaken the senses to religious devotion. Pictures are a natural thing you might turn to do that. That's something they sort of obviously excel at, given what they work with. And maybe you can say that stories tend to build extended structures concerning the small movements of the inner world, right? Like delicate negotiations and relations among thoughts within and between individuals. But, and so we can conclude from that, again, if that's what pictures are going to tend to excel at doing, and what stories are going to tend to excel at doing, given what the resources that they provide to work with, then imagination on the recipient's part, on the audience's part, is going to be compensating by supplying what is not directly supplied. So you are going to think that imagination is more likely to fill out pictorial meaning by amplifying what's actually given into this richer meaning. And it's more likely to fill in linguistic meaning by providing concrete detail when the meaning that is provided by language is relatively schematic. Maybe you could say something like the imagination is going to tend to work in a bottom-up way when engaged with pictures, and it's going to tend to work in a kind of top-down way when it's engaged with language. And I think that, I can so I do want to say that this thing that I just said, but I equally, at least as much, want to offer a bunch of caveats to that and say it's not that simple, right? So in particular, interpretation basically is always, as I said at the beginning, meaning always involves this total package of syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And so you're not just getting this, the encoded meaning. You've got a whole package. And in particular, interpretation always uses imagination to go beyond what's actually given. And in particular, aesthetic engagement doesn't just happen to, but is, invested in, often typically invested in a kind of creating what Collingwood calls a total imaginative experience, which recruits multiple modalities in imagination. So I think that like, oh, pictures are for sensations, this traffic in the senses, and stories are for trafficking in the mental processes. That's way too simple, because if you look at what's interesting about most, I wouldn't say any, most, pictures or most stories, it is exactly the ways in which they have this multiple modalities recruited together. And so that's the big caveat I want to make. I also think it's really important and really interesting the ways in which actual pictures and actual natural languages, especially natural languages, they don't lie at the extrema of this continuum that I laid out, right? So I laid out a sort of in principle extrema. A continuum with these two extremes. And so at the one extreme of really, we're not talking about pictures versus sentences. Really, at the one extreme of the iconic system, we have something like Borgesian maps, or really just like a model that fully replicates in every way what is being represented. And really, at the other extreme, we're not talking about natural language. We're talking about something like a predicate calculus, right? And actual pictures and actual natural languages do involve aspects of meaning that are not fully iconic or not fully discursive. So they traffic, they're hybrid systems to at least some degree. And in particular, artists often exploit those aspects of hybridity, the ways in which even language is partly iconic and the ways in which even pictures are partly discursive. And they find ways to augment the representational media as given to increase that hybridity. And so as a result, people who have thought about differences between formats in the artistic context have often been led to draw normative conclusions about what is, what you should be doing and what is best. And so I want to resist most of those conclusions. So I don't think there's a hierarchy of the artistic media. I don't think there's a best medium because it does, the one medium can do this most, the thing that art is most, suited to do. I don't think there's a best medium for a given subject. So it's not like if you want to tell things, if you want to depict time, then you should use words. And if you want to depict, space, you should use pictures. Because part of what might be interesting and challenging is to exactly surmount these challenges and to involve this entire package. And I also don't think there's a best subject for a particular medium. So, when Greenberg said, what each discipline should do, what each medium should do is focus on what it does best, what is distinctive of that medium, and really interrogate and, focus on that. And that, again, seems like a kind of norm that's coming out of an unjustified basis. So, the conclusion of this section is there are real differences between representational systems. Those differences make a real nuanced, concrete, particular difference to what it means to work with that medium, but they just offer a profile of constraints and possibilities, which are then available to be manipulated and worked with in lots of different kinds of ways. That's part of the aesthetic fun. Okay, so I don't know if that was the biggest section, but anyway, that's the first section. Can we have a little pause and just, I see some people who are looking slightly disoriented or disgruntled, can't tell. So let's have a little checking in and then we'll move on to the second section, a little breathing space and move on.